Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. I'm going to stall for just a minute while everybody makes it in from the waiting room. I hope you're all enjoying the sun today, even if it's still cold, but spring is coming. Okay. It looks like we've got everybody in from the waiting room, so we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to our noon webinar today, all about the benefits of electric vehicles. Um, if you're not familiar with Green Energy Consumers Alliance, we are a nonprofit organization based in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and we have a mission to empower consumers and communities to speed a just transition to a zero carbon world. What that means is we have various programs and services that help people access clean energy technologies, whether that's heat pumps or energy efficiency or solar or renewable energy or electric cars. And then we also do public policy advocacy work in both states to make sure that we've got laws on the books and are executing on those laws to reduce greenhouse gas emissions substantially, but also in a way that makes sense for consumers. And in today's webinar, I'll talk both about Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So you'll hear me switching between the two states quite a bit. My name is Anna Vanderspeck. I am our electric vehicle program director, and I'll be giving the presentation today. But I want to let my colleague introduce herself. Go ahead, Caroline.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caroline. I'm an electric vehicle program associate here on the Drive Green team, and I'll be helping to manage some of the Q&As during this presentation.
So as Caroline mentioned, please submit questions. We'll go over how to do that on this slide. So first things first, everybody's probably used to Zoom now, but you'll be muted throughout the webinar. But we absolutely do welcome your questions. So please submit them in the Q&A box on your Zoom console, and we'll answer as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. If you would like to use closed captions, you should also see a button that says CC on the bottom of your screen, and then text will appear in real time as I speak. And we will absolutely share the slides and a recording after the webinar, so don't feel like you need to take scribbled notes on every single detail. This presentation is broken up into three main parts today. So first, we will go through electric vehicle benefits. We're focusing here specifically about the societal benefits of transitioning to electric vehicles as a whole. Then we'll talk about state climate planning policies and progress in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And then briefly, we'll spend some time looking forward because there's a lot happening in this space right now. So right off the bat, we're going to talk about electric vehicle benefits. And if you've ever attended one of our Electric Vehicle 101 presentations, some of this will be familiar to you. But we wanted to just go through it step by step by step because there's a lot of misinformation about all of these topics floating around right now and a lot of noise. And so we just want to cut to it with some data and go through the benefits. And we'll start with the environmental benefits. We are Green Energy Consumers Alliance after all. So to do some level setting, transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. It's also the largest sector source in the entire country, but again, we'll focus on our two states. Here is the latest available data on this front. In Massachusetts, we've got 2021 greenhouse gas emission data from the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And in Rhode Island, we've got 2022 greenhouse gas emissions data from the Department of Environmental Management. And in both states, you can see that the orange slice of the pie, the transportation slice, is by far, or not by far, but it is the largest. Over the past couple of decades, we've done a pretty good job of cleaning up the electric sector, which is the 19% in Massachusetts and about 19% in Rhode Island, thanks to clean energy standards that add more renewable energy year after year. But buildings and transportation are the big challenging chunks, and of those, transportation is the larger chunk that we have to reckon with. Unfortunately, those transportation emissions are trending in the wrong direction, both nationally and in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. This is largely because we are driving larger and larger vehicles further and further distances. Electrification is taking a bite out of that, But first, we'll start with some high-level data. So this is the most recent available data about greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Rhode Island, comparing current levels of emissions to 1990, which is sort of the baseline year. You can see on the graph that our goal for 2030, or the requirement under the Act on Climate for 2030, is to reduce all greenhouse gas emissions 45% under those 1990 levels, and by 2040 to reduce them 80% under those 1990 levels. And the blue line shows you how we've been doing year after year since 1990. You can see that the general trend is downward, but the most recent year from 2020 to 2021, we've seen a big uptick in emissions. A lot of that has to do with the fact that in 2020, emissions dropped dramatically as a result of the pandemic. We were all driving less, there was less commercial activity, all of that reduced emissions overall. So some amount of rebound is to be expected, but it's still the opposite direction that we need that line to be going in. And transportation emissions in Rhode Island specifically increased 5.4% from 2020 to 2021. In Massachusetts, we've got slightly more granular data. So this is a graph from the Department of Environmental Protection, which shows the million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent from transportation for every year from 1990 to 2021. And you can see that though there has been a slight downward trend since the early 2000s, realistically, transportation emissions haven't decreased that much, with the exception of 2019 to 2020, when again the pandemic really shut everything down. But you can see that the line is starting to rebound already with the most recent data. And again, we're driving bigger and bigger cars further and further distances. We really need this line to be on more of a decline. But unfortunately, right now, the trend is definitely in the wrong direction. The good news is that electric vehicles dramatically reduce emissions, even when you take into account how the electricity fueling them is generated. And here we point to a resource that the Union of Concerned Scientists maintains. It's called their EV emissions tool. And what this tool allows you to do is choose any electric vehicle model and plug in a zip code. And this tool will calculate for you the relative emissions of that vehicle plugged into your local electric grid and show you how efficient a gas-powered car would need to be to have the same emissions as that electric vehicle. So here we just pulled out two somewhat random examples. So we've got a 2023 Chevy Bolt charging in a Boston zip code. And it shows you that that vehicle is so efficient that you would, if you wanted a gas car to produce the same amount of emissions per mile, it would need to get 130 miles per gallon. And for a 2022 Tesla Model Y charging in Providence, you'd need to have a gas car that goes 140, that gets 140 miles per gallon to have the same per mile emissions. That's really incredible. We've been working on internal combustion engines for over 100 years. We are nowhere near 130 or 140 miles per gallon. But one thing I want to underline with this source is that the Union of Concerned Scientists for this graphic uses regional data. So they're looking at the New England power grid as a whole. But thanks to those standards that I mentioned earlier, the electricity supply in Massachusetts and Rhode Island specifically is even cleaner. So the emissions reductions are even more for EVs charged up in our two states. And if you are one of an increasing number of residents of the two states who are enrolled in a green municipal aggregation program, your emissions will be even lower. If you haven't heard of green municipal aggregation, that's a program where municipalities go out and procure electricity for the city or town as a whole. And what they often do is add in more renewable energy than is required by state law. So if you're in one of those communities, you might have 5 or 10 or 15% more renewable energy in your mix than the state as a whole. And they also often give you the option to opt up to 100% renewable energy. And if you do that, your emissions go down all the way to zero. One cool way to see this in real time, or to see the impact of electric vehicles in real time, is to look at data from the Environmental Protection Agency in their 2024 Automotive Trends report. And this report is very, very long. We wrote a whole blog post about it, or Caroline wrote a whole blog post about it that you can read on our website. But we wanted to pull out this graphic in particular because it shows how important electric vehicles have been in the past decade to decreasing emissions and increasing efficiency. So in the graph on the left, you see the real world carbon dioxide emissions on a gram per mile basis of the fleet overall from 1975 to 2025. And you can see that that line has really decreased over time. And on the right, you can see the real world fuel economy or the miles per gallon of the fleet overall in the same time period. And you can see that that sort of conversely has gone up a lot. If you look really closely at the time period between 2015 and 2025, you see that the line splits into two. So the solid line shows you the trend for all vehicles that are model year 2023. And you can see that that decreases quite a bit from 2021 to 2022 to 2023 is when there's the starkest decrease in emissions and the starkest increase in efficiency. But if you look at the dotted line right next to it, that is the line of what all model year 2023 vehicles look like if you remove all the battery electric vehicles and all the plug-in hybrids. And you can see that if you remove all the plug-in vehicles, the trend line basically flattens out. You don't see any decreases in per mile emissions, and you don't really see any increases in efficiency once you take out all of the electric vehicles. And to us, that further proves the point that we've squeezed everything we can squeeze out of internal combustion engines. And to see the sorts of efficiency gains and emissions reductions that we need to see in the coming years, electric vehicles are what's going to achieve that. So far, we've been talking about emissions on a grams per mile basis or just a per mile basis, but obviously we want to look at the whole life cycle of the vehicle. And to that, for that, we point again to a different resource by the Union of Concerned Scientists, which did what's called a cradle to grave analysis of the global warming emissions of manufacturing and operating a car and a truck, gas one and electric one in both cases. So to interpret this graph, you'll notice that the left two bars are about cars, the right two bars are about trucks. In both cases, you see a orange bar, and that reflects the emissions from manufacturing the vehicle. So you can see that all of them have it. The emissions for manufacturing the vehicle are higher for trucks than for cars, but slightly lower for electric cars compared to gas cars. However, you have to factor in the emissions from producing the battery, and that's the blue line. So you can see that electric cars and electric trucks both have not insignificant global warming emissions produced by creating the battery. They're larger for the truck than they are for the car. And when you add the battery manufacturing and the vehicle manufacturing emissions, the upfront emissions from electric vehicles are higher than those of their gas counterparts. But over the lifetime of the vehicle, they are much lower once you factor in the operating emissions, which is basically the combustion of the fuel or the generation of the electricity. So for a gas car, you can see that the reduction is 52% over the life of the vehicle. For the truck, it's 57%. This, again, is assuming the average electricity mix of the country as a whole, which is a little bit dirtier than what we have here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So the reduction would be even starker for an electric vehicle charged up on our grid here at home. But this graphic to us drives home 2 points. One is that over the life of the car, electric vehicles clearly win out in terms of global warming emissions. And two, there are much fewer emissions associated with cars and smaller cars compared to trucks or larger vehicles. So from a climate perspective, if you need a car, the best thing you can do is drive the smallest electric vehicle that meets your needs. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of public health and safety as well. I've mentioned a couple times that we have clean energy standards in Massachusetts and Rhode Island that are why our grid right now is cleaner than the region and the country as a whole. The good news is that electric vehicles will only get cleaner over time as both Massachusetts and Rhode Island add more renewable energy thanks to those standards. So if you buy an electric vehicle today, 5 years from now, it will be cleaner. Even if it's the same exact vehicle, it will be cleaner because our electricity mix will be cleaner. And you definitely can't say the same thing about a gas car. So how do all those standards work? We would need a whole webinar to talk about that. But for Massachusetts, we're sharing this graphic from the Department of Environmental Protection, which shows how the various standards stack on top of each other. I definitely don't have time to go through what all of those standards are, but I will point to 2025, 63% of our electricity mix comes from non-fossil fuels. So that's 37% is fossil fuels. And that fossil fuel slice is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller in the coming years, thanks to all of those standards, which means those EV emissions will go down year by year by year. In Rhode Island, the graphic is a little simpler. The renewable energy standard ramps up the amount of our electricity that comes from renewable sources year after year until we meet 100% in 2033. And that again means that an electric vehicle will get more and more efficient in terms of emissions year after year after year. I do want to pause or take a moment to acknowledge that emissions in terms of air pollution are not the only environmental impacts of producing or driving vehicles. There are absolutely environmental and social harms related to any kind of resource extraction, whether we're talking about oil, coal, or methane, or any other fossil fuel that we're digging out of the ground all over the world, or lithium, graphite, nickel, or any of the other minerals and metals that we use in manufacturing electric vehicle batteries specifically, but also vehicles generally. We like to point to a resource that adds up the sheer tonnage of raw materials that need to be pulled out of the ground for a fossil fuel-based economy versus a clean energy-based economy. And that math shows that a fossil fuel-based economy requires hundreds of times more mining than a clean energy-based economy. And the good news with EV batteries in particular is that when the batteries reach the end of their useful life in a vehicle, we can still use those batteries for stationary storage to balance out supply and demand on the electric grid or provide backup power at buildings. And when those batteries reach the end of that useful life, they can be recycled and we can recover those minerals. So the combination of this reuse and recycling and better battery chemistries over time will reduce the need for new mining over time. One example that I like to point to here is that cobalt is one of the raw substances that was used in electric vehicle batteries 10 years ago, a little bit more. A lot of the batteries that were being used for vehicles in the United States were nickel, manganese, cobalt batteries, and cobalt was a really key ingredient. There are well-documented problems with the cobalt supply chain, particularly in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We wrote a blog post about that years ago. But what's happened in the interim is that the market has really shifted away from cobalt, partially because of the political pressure as a result of the human rights abuses, but partially because there's just better battery chemistries now. So now it's mostly lithium iron phosphate. We could spend so many hours going through each of the individual minerals or metals and figuring out where they come from and how they're being used and all of that. But the overall point here is that we only need to pull those things out of the ground once, and then we can reuse and recycle, as opposed to a fossil fuel-based economy where we have to continually pump out these fossil fuels, whether we're talking about the United States or the Niger Delta or so many other places in the world. A lot of people on this front get very interested in recycling, which we are too. And this is the best resource that we can point to illustrate this idea. It's a couple years old now, and I'm looking forward to a new one, but it comes from the International Council on Clean Transportation, the ICCT. And what they did is look at the installed recycling capacity for electric vehicle batteries and the announced electric vehicle recycling plants every year from when they did this analysis through the end of through half of the century Obviously, the further we go out on this graph, the more assumptions there are. But for the near term, they looked really closely at announcements about new battery recycling plants, or plans, or partnerships to build out this graph. And basically, as of September 2023, there was enough installed and announced recycling capacity to carry us through the 2030s. So this, I think, is a rare good news story in this space. If you haven't heard of Redwood Materials, they're one of the larger recycling companies in this space that has partnered with lots of automakers to not only recycle the old batteries, but then supply some of those minerals and raw materials for new batteries. So they're definitely a company to watch if you're interested in this space. All of the federal threats to the Inflation Reduction Act are definitely something to watch in this space too, because there were significant incentives to build recycling plants that are now at risk. But the good news is that the minerals and the materials in these batteries are so valuable that a recycling supply chain will build itself up. We just have to keep making sure that it's building itself up fast enough. But for the moment, we're actually ahead of schedule. I'll shift now from environmental benefits to public health benefits. And here we point to the American Lung Association because they have done a ton of work on this front. And we'll cite two of their reports, which are pretty similar, but have really good data. So first, the American Lung Association modeled what it means for emissions to shift to 100% of new car sales by 2030 and 100% of new medium and heavy duty vehicles being electric by 2040, along with 100% renewable energy. So obviously not every state is on this trajectory, but they modeled out if we were to be, what would that mean? And they found really dramatic benefits with regards to key pollutants like nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds, which together react in the atmosphere to create smog, which increases chances of asthma, heart attack, stroke, and more. They also found dramatic reductions in fine particle pollution or particulate matter. PM 2.5 specifically is what they studied. PM 2.5 increases chances of asthma, lung cancer, heart disease, lots of other things. And they also found significant benefits in reductions of sulfur dioxide emissions, which reduce lung function. All of those are abounding in our air right now and causing lots of health harm, which I think not everybody realizes because we don't have smog the way it looked like in the 70s, but these are really still creating real harm. And that's something that we saw in how COVID impacted different communities and places where there's more pollution like this. People's lungs were less able to deal with the challenge of COVID. The American Lung Association has this somewhat intimidating table that shows by 2030, 2040, and 2050 what emissions reductions we see in each of those categories. We're not going to go through every box on this. We'll send out the slides for sure, but I wanted to point out two things on this. One is that light duty vehicles see the biggest impact really in the greenhouse gas emission bucket. That's hundreds of millions of tons per year emissions reductions in this scenario that they modeled. And medium and heavy duty vehicles see a much larger impact in nitrogen oxides and really all of the pollutants that harm human health. This is something we've talked about in previous webinars and blog posts before, that medium and heavy duty vehicles, particularly those that drive on diesel fuel, are really disproportionately polluting in terms of public health. So together, these emissions reductions really add up. In a separate report, the ALA added all this up in terms of what it means for dollars. And so here they studied the cumulative health benefits from 2020 to 2050 for every state in the country, assuming all new vehicle sales are electric by 2035 and that we've got non-combustion power. In Massachusetts, those health benefits totaled $14.7 billion. So that is specifically avoided asthma attacks and ER visits, avoided lost days of work, and avoided premature deaths. And in Rhode Island, that totaled to $3.2 billion. So these are expenses that we will pay in other ways if we don't make the transition to electric vehicles. Moving on, I want to highlight two important facts when it comes to public health. The first is that health harms from internal combustion engines are not distributed equally across communities. They are most felt in low-income communities and communities of color. Here we'll point again to a study from the Union of Concerned Scientists, which looked at the exposure to PM 2.5, that particulate matter, for different populations across the country. And it found that Asian, African American, and Latino or Hispanic communities are much more likely to be exposed to particulate matter pollution from vehicles than white communities, or in this case, also Native American communities. And there's similar data like this from Massachusetts and Rhode Island that tells the same story. And then secondly, we want to point out that climate change itself is a public health threat in so many ways. And there again, the harm is not distributed equally. It's low-income communities and communities of color that are hit first and worst internationally, nationally, and in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So transitioning our fleet of vehicles from fossil fuel powered vehicles to electric vehicles addresses this both directly and indirectly. I'll move now from public health benefit to economic benefit. So every year we have billions of dollars that are flowing out of our region because every time that we purchase gas that is gas or diesel that is extracted and processed in other parts of the country, those or other parts of the country or other parts of the world, excuse me, those dollars flow out of the region. But if we charge up our electric vehicle, those are dollars that flow in region to generators on our electric grid that are increasingly wind and solar and other renewable energy sources. And so there's an economic benefit of keeping those dollars in region. We did some very quick back of the envelope math on this. In Massachusetts, in 2024, we consumed 2.5 billion gallons of gasoline. According to the Energy Information Administration, the average gas price in 2024 was $3.39. And so in 2024, the state expended roughly $8.47 billion on gasoline. In Rhode Island, that number is a little bit smaller because there's fewer vehicles and people drive fewer miles in Rhode Island. But altogether, this is billions of dollars that are flowing out of the region that we could keep in region with electric vehicles. In addition, if you've been to one of our EV 101 presentations, you know that electric vehicles have lower maintenance costs and lower fuel costs. For maintenance costs, it's roughly half of what you'd pay for an equivalent gas car over the vehicle's lifetime. And for fuel costs, you can consistently save a couple of cents per mile driven. And that's true even though we've got relatively high electricity prices compared to the rest of the country. And all of those saved dollars as we're switching to electric vehicles can be invested in the local economy in different ways. If you're curious about fuel costs in particular, there are a couple of calculators that we link to on our website. The first is maintained currently by the federal government on the fueleconomy.gov website. It's a great resource where you can select a specific vehicle and compare vehicles side by side. I quite honestly don't know how much longer that will be maintained, but luckily there's a separate, very similar calculator called Choose EV that we link to from our website as well, where again, you can plug in different vehicles, adjust the price to reflect what you actually pay for electricity, and it'll do the math for you to see what you might save. Moving from sort of maintenance and fuel costs, we're going to talk about the grid a little bit. And electric vehicles, often when you talk about the grid, people think only of the costs of incorporating more electric vehicle charging and don't see the benefits in terms of the revenue that they bring in. But analysis by economists has shown that electric vehicles can exert a downward pressure on electric rates because the revenue they bring in exceeds the costs of upgrading infrastructure. Synapse Energy Economics has done analyses like these for all of the states in the country. They've been doing it for California for years because California is several steps ahead of us in terms of EV adoption. But most recently, they did this analysis for both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So on these graphs, you can see the revenues brought in by electric vehicles. So that's basically all the cents per kilowatt hour that those drivers pay into the system when they charge their vehicles. And then you can compare that to the costs of incorporating those vehicles, both the infrastructure costs in terms of distribution, transmission, and then the energy costs in terms of the actual kilowatt hours you're delivering and the capacity costs. And you can see that for every year that they looked at since 2011, the revenues exceed the costs by a wide margin. So in Massachusetts, we've seen a cumulative net impact of $71.2 million in benefits. And in Rhode Island, that's $3.8 million in benefits. And again, that can translate into a downward pressure on electricity rates. So particularly right now, when there's so much in the news about energy costs, this is a really important fact to have at hand. Finally, in this section, electric vehicles are really unique in that they can help us smooth out supply and demand on the grid, and that reduces costs for all of us. If you're familiar with our Shave the Peak program, or if you've attended any of our webinars on managed charging, you'll know that electricity demand does not stay flat throughout the year or throughout the day. There are moments where more of us turn on our air conditioners and all of our electric appliances, and electricity demand spikes. And those peak moments are disproportionately polluting and disproportionately expensive. So the more we can bring down those peaks, the better for all of us economically and environmentally. Electric vehicles are a resource on this front because if you have an EV and you want to drive to work tomorrow at 8 a.m., you don't really care if your vehicle is charging at 2 in the morning or at 12 p.m. the day before, as long as you know your vehicle is charged. And so electric vehicle load, or the demand, is really flexible. You can shift it without impacting the driver very much. And so you can shift it to moments that are beneficial for the grid. So one example is to ramp down charging at those peak moments to reduce peak demand. But another example is to intentionally shift it when there's times of excess renewable energy generation. In California right now, they're seeing this a lot where they've got so much solar that sometimes in the middle of the day, they're kind of swamped with solar. And so telling electric vehicle owners to charge during that time soaks up that renewable energy and means that those EVs don't have to charge at other times when there's less renewable energy. And then finally, the sort of very new exciting thing on this front is that electric vehicles can discharge energy back onto the grid during peak periods. The picture on the left is a picture of an electric school bus in Beverly that's been doing this for a couple of summers. So on those really hot peak days during the summer, the buses will charge overnight when demand is low and then discharge energy back onto the grid, which means that that's one fewer power plant, basically. Not a whole power plant, but we can reduce the need to turn on power plants by using the battery, the energy stored in these EVs batteries. Right now, that's mostly happening with larger buses or larger vehicles like these school buses, but we're really looking forward in the coming years to see more of that done with passenger electric vehicles. So that concludes our first section, and now I'll talk about sort of state climate planning. What are the policies we have in place? Where are we in this whole transition? So both Massachusetts and Rhode Island have laws on the books that I've alluded to several times before that require economy-wide greenhouse gas emission reductions. They're not aspirational goals, they are requirements. And in both states, we have to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And what that means is whatever greenhouse gas emissions we're still emitting at that point, we have to use some sort of technology to suck the equivalent amount of greenhouse gas emissions back out of the atmosphere. We have interim targets. In Massachusetts, we have to reduce economy-wide emissions 50% by 2030. In Rhode Island, it's 45%, but in both states, that's comparing to those 1990 levels. And for this presentation and for much of our public policy advocacy, we're really laser focused on that 2030 goal because that is the closest goal. It's within sight. We really have to make sure that we meet that goal so that we can worry about 2040 next. But 2030 is knocking on our doors. Massachusetts climate planning is pretty specific on what that means for the electric vehicle transition. The Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030 says that to reach that 50% reduction goal, we have to replace 900,000 of the 5.3 million vehicles on the road with electric vehicles by 2030. That is about 17% of the entire vehicle fleet has to be electric by that date. Right now, Massachusetts has a great resource called the Mass Vehicle Census that is updated twice a year that shows you exactly how many vehicles are registered, what types, where are they. There's tons of information in that resource. But what it shows is that as of January 1st of this year, 1.7% of the vehicles on the road were battery electric vehicles, and about 1% are plug-in hybrids. So right now, a total 2.6% of the vehicles on the road in Massachusetts are some sort of plug-in vehicle. The distribution of those electric vehicles really varies from city to city. So in some places it's 0%, but in the community with the highest level of EV adoption, we're at 11%, which is within shouting distance of 17% for sure, but we need that statewide average or the statewide total to come up to 17% by 2030. Massachusetts is also pretty specific in terms of what we need for chargers. Here we point to the work of the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Coordinating Council, or EVIC, which if you're really excited about this topic and want to learn more, the next meeting is at 1 p.m. right after this webinar. But this is a interagency council where representatives from all of the agencies that have something to do with energy or transportation meet to figure out, okay, what do we need in terms of charging infrastructure by 2030, and how are we going to get there? And so the initial assessment that they delivered to the legislature back in 2022 found that we need 10,000 public DC fast charging ports by 2030. Those are the super high-powered ones that you might see along highways or at rest stops. We need 35,000 public level 2 ports, and we need 700,000 workplace and residential ports. Last week, when we were preparing these slides, we looked at the Alternative Fuels Data Center, which shows you exactly how many charging stations are in each state. And it's set in Massachusetts, so that's 11% of the way, and about 7,500 public level 2 ports, so we're about 22% of the way. And there's no way that we're aware of to track how many workplace and residential installations have happened. So it's unknown how close we are to that 700,000 number, but clearly a ways to go still. Rhode Island's climate plans are unfortunately less detailed. The latest plan in Rhode Island is the 2022 Climate Action Plan, and that's sort of the equivalent to the Clean Energy and Climate Plan that I just talked about, in that it's supposed to lay out how do we reach the 45% emissions reductions by 2030. Unfortunately, it fell short. So if you add up the emissions reductions from all the things it talks about, it only results in 39% emissions reductions. Right now, the state is in the process of working on the 2025 update to that plan, and there are lots and lots of public hearings and info sessions if you want to contribute to that process. But unlike the Clean Energy and Climate Plan in Massachusetts, Rhode Island's Climate Action Plan does not set a sector-specific greenhouse gas emission sublimit, nor does it have any specific goals for the number of EVs or the number of chargers. And Rhode Island doesn't have a clean vehicle census the way Massachusetts does, so it's very difficult to get an up-to-date number on the number of electric vehicles registered in Rhode Island. So clearly work to do there. I'll pause right here to say, many of you are probably going, this is all great, but what about reducing vehicle miles traveled, or VMT? Both Massachusetts and Rhode Island's climate plans call for reducing vehicle miles traveled by supporting better walking, biking, and public transit infrastructure. The success of those policies depends on our ability to fund them, and both states are struggling to find that funding pretty publicly, whether we're talking about funding the MBTA and the backlog of repairs there, or fully funding the transit master plan or the bike master plan in Rhode Island. And that's unfortunately just going to keep getting more difficult as federal funding becomes more and more scarce. This webinar is really focused on electric cars because we've only got an hour, but this slide is to say, yes, we absolutely need to reduce VMT by getting people out of cars for climate reasons, but also health and public safety. But we know that our entire landscape and economy is really based on cars. So there's plenty of people who still need a vehicle. So we want to make sure it's possible for those folks to drive electric if they can. We definitely don't have time to go through every single policy on this slide, but we will share these slides. But I just wanted to highlight the sort of categories of policies that the two states are pursuing to accelerate this transition to electric vehicles. So both states have adopted vehicle standards out of California that are really important in that they increase the percentage of clean vehicles that are delivered to our two states every year. Both states have some level of purchase incentives for individuals or fleets. Massachusetts has several electric vehicle charger installation incentives. Rhode Island has a new program called Power Up RI that does that as well. Really crucially, in Massachusetts, our electric utilities have programs to help support the installation of charging stations, and in Rhode Island Energy does not. That's a key area where we think Rhode Island could be stepping up. And then we've had previous webinars that are all about managed or smart charging programs. In Massachusetts, National Grid has a program that we think could be stronger. Eversource just proposed a new program, so the Department of Public Utilities has to approve it. And in Rhode Island, we've got an EV demand response program that we had a webinar about a couple months ago. All of those we think could be more robust. I do want to call out one cornerstone policy, which is called Advanced Clean Cars 2, or ACC 2. This policy has been adopted by many states across the country, and what it does is require manufacturers to supply an increasing percentage of electric vehicles year over year. So it only affects new cars, and the graph on the left shows you the trajectory. So basically starting with model year 2026, 35% of the new vehicles that are delivered need to be electric, and that increases steadily over time until we reach 100% in 2035. ACC2 is a central pillar of both Massachusetts and Rhode Island's climate laws. And we think it's a great policy because it levels the playing field for manufacturers. Everybody knows this is the timeline we have to abide by, so there's a little bit less risk in deciding, do we go faster, do we go slower than other manufacturers? It's just, here's the rules, this is what we need. It's a gradual transition. Let's go. With that, I'll transition to looking forward, but I'm going to start with some good news before we go to the federal updates. So one thing that I want to make clear with this webinar is that the transition to electric vehicles is global. And so what happens in our states or our country is important and something we need to work on, but there's a whole lot going on outside of those constraints that are worth keeping an eye on. Bloomberg New Energy Finance is a global analyst firm, basically, and they put out a report every year called EV Outlook, where they pull together a lot of great data to show trends. And this is from their 2024 report, which reports on 2023 data. And what you can see is that globally, EVs made up 4% of vans and trucks, 18% of passenger vehicle sales, 26% of bus sales, and almost 50% of two and three wheelers, which are a primary mode of transportation in many countries around the world. These numbers are much higher than what we see in the United States, but that is this global momentum that is pushing the market this way, whether we have a federal tax credit or not. So that's point one. Point two is, as I mentioned, those numbers are a lot higher than what we're seeing in the United States. And that's because the global shift to electric vehicles is stronger in China and in the European Union, and increasingly in other countries around the world as well. So on the chart on the left, you can see just the sheer numbers of EV sales. The red bar is China, the next sort of teal color is Europe, and blue is the United States. And you can see that from the get-go, the numbers have been higher in Europe and China than in the US, and the growth has been higher as well. On the right, you can see the percentage of new passenger vehicle sales that are electric. And you can see two things. One is that there are many regions of the world whose line is above the United States. So red line is China. Again, the teal line is Europe. Those are both well above the blue line for the United States. And the United States is even under the global average, which is that dotted black line. So one is that our numbers are just lower than the rest of the world. But two is the point that the slope of those lines, the increase from year over year, is a lot steeper in other parts of the world. So in China, if you look, the red line is basically under 10% until about 2020, and then it just picks up, and that line gets a whole lot steeper. The same can be said for Europe from 2019 to 2021. And so if you've ever heard of an adoption curve of an S curve, it's you start kind of slow and then you start to pick up and pick up and pick up. And it's these kinds of graphs that give us confidence that we can jump from where we are now to 35% of model year 2026, if we can get on that S curve as well. I'll spend a little moment talking about federal threats, and then I want to make sure we've got time for questions, and I see lots of questions popping up, so I'll do my best to wrap it up quickly. So we do face pretty substantial federal threats right now to the transition to electric vehicles. I'm just going to run through a bullet point list here. One point is that the current administration has made it very clear that they want to weaken federal vehicle standards, both the CAFE standards, which regulate vehicle efficiency out of the Department of Transportation, and the EPA standards that regulate emissions. The current administration is going to take several different legal routes to try and weaken those, but it's clear that's a target. They also want to repeal or weaken the federal tax credit for electric vehicles and charging stations. Because those tax credits were brought into place by the Inflation Reduction Act, we will need an act of Congress to undo those. What we've been reading is that they will try and do that through budget reconciliation. So we'll see later this year how that goes. It's also clear that the administration wants to gut the Inflation Reduction Act as a whole. And though most people think Inflation Reduction Act, federal tax credit for purchasing EVs, there's tons of other stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of direct funding, but also tax credits for battery manufacturing and recycling and vehicle manufacturing. A lot of that funding is going to states that are red states or districts that are held by Republicans in Congress. So it's possible that some of those provisions may be more likely to survive than others, but we will have to see. The Trump administration has already made it clear that they want to stop the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or NEVI, as well as the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program, CFI. These are both programs that came out of the bipartisan infrastructure law. The NEVI program is formula funding, so each state just received a certain amount depending on whatever formula they use. And the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program was competitive, so states or other entities had to put forward applications and win funding. It seems that NEVI funding, a lot of it has already been obligated or dispersed. So in Massachusetts, the Department of Transportation was supposed to receive $63.5 million. They've received 50 million, so 50 million is safe. The remaining 13.5 is TBD. Rhode Island has already installed a bunch of charging stations, but I do know that Rhode Island won a CFI grant, which is now on hold sort of indefinitely. So that is a lot of funding that we were counting on to build out charging. But in Massachusetts in particular, I want to put this in context that the NEVI program is $63.5 million, which is a fair chunk of change. But the electric vehicle charging programs from our utilities, National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil, are $400 million. So it's not the only program advancing EV charging in Massachusetts, but it is obviously an important one. It's also clear that the federal government wants to remove key funding opportunities that relate to this, like the Clean School Bus Program, even DERA grants, so Diesel Emission Reduction Act grants, basically any place where they can claw back funding for clean energy things, they're going to try and pursue. It's also clear that they want to attack the right of California to set emission standards and the rights of other states to adopt them. So this is the advanced clean cars, the advanced clean trucks, and the heavy duty omnibus regulations that I just mentioned. The Trump administration basically wants to rescind our states' rights to adopt those standards. And then very timely today, The implementation of tariffs is throwing the entire auto market into chaos. We're publishing a blog post on this today. Impacts are really TBD on that front, but it's clear that uncertainty is not good for people's purchasing decisions. All of this is to say these federal policy decisions are obviously threats on a national level to our ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, public health, and honestly, the American auto industry. But they hit close to home because every federal delay or rescission makes it harder for Massachusetts and Rhode Island to meet our climate mandates. So I want to leave you with the top 5 most important things that we think our state should be pursuing right now. In no particular order, defend and implement those vehicle standards, work hard on rate design and grid modernization, and adequately direct and scrutinize utility programming, support the build out of EV charging, support purchase incentives for electric vehicles, particularly for low and moderate income drivers and high mileage drivers, and then support EV education to increase awareness and combat misinformation because there's a whole lot of that out there right now. I'm going to fly through these last slides so we have time for questions. So first, I want to say thank you. There's lots of ways for you to interact with us if you'd like. We'll send out more information in an email. If you want to buy an electric car or understand the different models, we've got a great tool for you where you can sort and filter by all sorts of different characteristics, learn which vehicles qualify for what, whether they can charge on Tesla chargers or not. Basically, all the key information we think you need is available at our EV Finder. We've got lots of upcoming events, a series of webinars on charging, but also information about heat pumps or wind turbines, lots of stuff coming up. We are a nonprofit, and I'm contractually obliged to say if you are able and willing, we would always appreciate a donation so that we can make more content like this available for free. And I will now move to questions. So I know Caroline has been diligently watching all the questions come in, so we'll answer as many as we can.
Yeah, we have a question from the chat. One person is wondering how we can make EVs more affordable so that they're more feasible choice for everyone.
So there's a couple of different strategies, and they're mostly the ones that I've talked about already. So one is our 2 states can offer direct purchase incentives, which they do. In Massachusetts, the program is called More EV. In Rhode Island, the program is called Drive RI. And those both have increased incentives for low or moderate income drivers. I think the bigger picture is like globally, how can we bring down the costs of the vehicles at the MSRP point? And I think that's where those standards that I was talking about really play in. So the advanced clean car standards are requiring automakers to sell an increasing percentage of vehicles that are electric, which means that those automakers have to strategize, how are we going to make electric vehicles at a price point that people will buy? Some automakers have been focusing their electrification efforts on more expensive luxury models because that's where they can make the most money. But standards like that will force those automakers to make vehicles that are more affordable to the masses. And also, as we buy more and more new vehicles that are electric, we'll have more and more used vehicles on the used vehicle market, which is where most people purchase vehicles. So I think upfront incentives, those standards to force manufacturers, and then the third piece is rate design, which is a whole other category that we didn't have enough time to talk about today. But basically, we need to figure out how to price electricity so that when you make the switch from a gas car to an electric vehicle or heating oil to a heat pump, there's a financial incentive there that you see lower operating costs by making that switch. But we also need to make sure that we've got all the funding we need to maintain our infrastructure. So we think that Massachusetts and Rhode Island really should focus in on that area in the coming years, in part to respond to your point.
Great. There's another question about insurance rates for electric vehicles and whether insurance rates might meet parity sometime soon with ICE vehicles.
This is a question that is very difficult to answer in right now in particular. So there are some electric vehicle models where insurance rates are very high. We've seen that historically, like with Tesla vehicles, but not necessarily all of them. So there hasn't been a particularly clear sway one way or the other on that front. What is complicated now is that the tariffs that are being placed on auto parts mean auto repairs will get much more expensive, and that will trickle into insurance rates. So I think right now the entire automotive industry is sort of reckoning with what these tariffs mean. The uncertainty of it all is very challenging with the on again, off again nature of it all. But unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to that right now because literally today, everything is changing.
Someone had a question about the Bloomberg EV report,
Mhm.
asking if new vehicle sales also includes leasing.
That is a great question. I believe it does. I would need to double check on that report, but I'm pretty sure it does. It's just looking at vehicles like placed, which I think includes leasing.
And we have another question. I'm not sure if we have enough time to answer it, but someone was asking what the rationale is for excluding battery manufacturing costs in the cradle to grave analysis that you were talking about earlier in the presentation. Um,
They
and they
are
also,
included.
Mhm. And they also wanted to ask how many more emissions would be expected, um,
Um,
those costs being included.
I'll go back to that slide because the battery manufacturing emissions are included in that analysis. Where am I? So, and if the question is a different question, if I'm interpreting the question incorrectly, please feel free to write in again. But in both of these, the battery manufacturing costs in terms of emissions are incorporated here. And that, quite frankly, as far as I can, in my opinion, is the key point of this analysis is including those so that you can compare, okay, yes, you do see that higher, you see an emissions bump in manufacturing, but that's overcome by the reduction when you look at operating emissions.
Yeah, we had another question asking if we can speak to green energy consumers' efforts to advocate for increased EV charging availability in lower income neighborhoods in Massachusetts and Rhode Island.
Yes, I will do this rapid fire. Sorry, everybody, that the presentation took so long. Um, in I'll do it state by state. In Massachusetts, we have make-ready programs and electric vehicle rebate programs or charger rebate programs from our utilities, National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil. And those offer increased support in environmental justice communities, particularly communities that are low income. And when those proposals were before the Department of Public Utilities, one of the key arguments that we made in our comments in that process was that those communities do need increased help to cover those costs. Um, in Rhode Island, Rhode Island is a little bit behind in terms of all things with electric vehicles. We've been pushing for years for the utility in Rhode Island, which is Rhode Island Energy, to have a make-ready program at all and to follow the model basically set by the utilities in Massachusetts. That unfortunately has not borne fruit yet for various reasons, but it's something that we're definitely focused on. Programmatically, we're working on a couple different projects that are actually all about installing charging stations in low-income communities, and particularly for high mileage drivers, so folks who drive for Uber or Lyft or taxi companies, so that they can have access to charging, which is a really big barrier for that community. That's through a program funded by the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center called Ride Clean Mass Charging Hubs. And in Rhode Island, we were really excited for the community fueling infrastructure grant that Rhode Island's Office of Energy Resources won, because the whole point of that project was to install charging stations in environmental justice communities in Rhode Island. And we were excited about the prospect of doing community outreach and education around those charging stations. And that is now all halted with the federal funds. So definitely a priority that we're working on in a couple different ways.
There are a few remaining questions, but I'm sure we can follow up when we send the slides.
I time runs, what is it? When you're having fun, you lose track of time. So thank you everybody for this super fun. webinar about electric vehicles. I've definitely appreciated all of your questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to more of them. We'll send out a recording of the webinar as well as the slides. And if you have questions that we didn't answer, I will go back to the last slide with my email address. You're welcome to send me an email with your questions or respond to the email that we'll send out with the slides and recording soon. So thanks again for your attention, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.